For decades, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were bound by one of music's most complicated relationships. They were brothers in the Beatles, one of the most successful bands in human history. But beneath the harmonies and the screaming crowds lay a conflict so deep that George once said Paul was overpowering. A conflict so painful that George refused to play music with Paul again for years. And yet, in 2001, when George Harrison lay dying, Paul rushed to his bedside. What he said when he walked into that hospital room would reveal something the world had never fully understood about their 30-year feud. It was not hate that defined them, it was something far more complex. And for the first time, Paul is breaking the silence about what really happened between him and his little brother. Let's find out. But before we dive into what really happened between these two icons, stay with us, because the complete story of Paul and George's relationship is far more complicated and far more human than the headlines ever suggested. To understand the tragedy of Paul and George's falling out, we first have to understand the gift of their beginning. Paul McCartney was born in Liverpool in 1942 to a working-class family. His mother died when he was 14 years old. Music became his language for grief. A year later, he met John Lennon at a church dance in Liverpool. They formed a bond that would reshape popular music forever. But Paul's story with George Harrison started differently. George was younger, born in 1943, and they met on the bus rides through Liverpool. What made their connection remarkable was that despite their age difference, they shared something profound, an unshakable belief that music was everything. Paul began helping George learn the guitar. When John and Paul needed a third guitarist, Paul championed George. He fought for him. He believed in him when George was still just a teenage kid with big dreams. By the time the Beatles formed in 1960, Paul had become George's mentor and his protector. George looked up to Paul not just as a musician, but as an older brother. For the early years of the Beatles, from 1960 to about 1965, this dynamic worked. The three founding members plus Ringo created the most successful band in human history. They went from Liverpool clubs to sold-out stadiums in America. They revolutionized popular music. But there was always an imbalance embedded in the structure of the Beatles. John and Paul wrote almost everything together. They were the creative engine. Ringo was the rhythm keeper. And George was the third guitarist, the subordinate songwriter, the one whose contributions were acknowledged but rarely celebrated. In the early years, George accepted this. He was grateful to be there. He was playing music with John Lennon and Paul McCartney. What else could a kid from Liverpool dream of? But by 1966, something had shifted inside George. He was no longer a kid. He was a sophisticated musician and songwriter in his own right. He had written songs of genuine depth and originality. If I needed you, think for yourself. I want to tell you, these were not the work of a sideman. These were the work of an artist. And yet, the recording process remained the same. When Paul had an idea, everyone jumped to attention. When George had an idea, it was often pushed aside, reworked, or recorded quickly and moved on from. This was not intentional cruelty on Paul's part. This was simply the reality of being the dominant creative force in a band. Paul was driven. He was ambitious. He had a clear vision for what the Beatles should sound like. But for George, this drive felt like suffocation. It felt like being trapped inside someone else's dream. The younger brother who had once admired the older brother's confidence began to resent it. And that resentment would grow until it nearly destroyed them. The first visible cracks appeared not in private arguments, but in the actual recording sessions. By 1967, multiple sources close to the Beatles documented the tension. George's own diary entries from this period, later revealed in various interviews and biographies, show a growing frustration. "I'm not being heard," he wrote. Paul decides everything. In 1968, during the White Album sessions, the tension became visible to everyone. George walked out of the studio multiple times. He was tired of fighting to get his songs recorded. He was tired of Paul's arrangement choices overriding his own. Most tellingly, George's songs were consistently relegated to the B-sides or given minimal instrumentation. Meanwhile, Paul's compositions received elaborate production, full orchestration, and absolute creative control. But the most telling moment came not in the studio, it came in public. In interviews from 1967 and 1968, George began speaking candidly about his frustrations with the Beatles' creative process. He spoke about wanting more freedom. He spoke about the overpowering nature of the partnership between John and Paul. Music journalists noticed the shift in his tone. The grateful younger brother was becoming a frustrated artist. What makes this moment significant is that George was not complaining about Paul's talent. He was not saying Paul was wrong. He was saying that talent without space becomes oppression. That partnership without equality becomes hierarchy. That love without respect becomes control. These were the first warnings that something would eventually break. And unlike so many warning signs in human relationships, people were actually paying attention. The world could see the cracks forming, but nobody knew how deep they went. Not yet. But this tension that had been building in whispers and diary entries was about to explode into something much more serious. And what happened next would define the next 30 years of their lives. January 10th, 1969. The Beatles were in their most famous creative period, and it was also their most toxic. They had rented Twickenham Film Studios to rehearse new material. The intention was to capture the creative process on film. What they captured instead was the deterioration of a brotherhood. On that January morning, something inside George finally broke. During a rehearsal session, while Paul was directing the band through yet another arrangement, George put down his guitar and walked out. He did not storm out. He did not yell. He simply left. Later, he would describe the moment in an interview that still reverberates today. The atmosphere had become very unhealthy and unhappy. I could not work in that environment any longer. What George did next revealed the depth of his frustration. He did not come back the next day. He did not come back the week after. For several weeks, George Harrison disappeared from the Beatles entirely. He went to Greece with his wife, Pattie Boyd. He needed to get away. He needed to remember who he was outside of Paul's shadow. Paul's response to George's departure reveals much about the dynamic between them. Rather than reaching out to reconcile, Paul largely carried on without him. Ringo noted in his journals that the band suddenly felt lighter without George's presence. Not because George was difficult, but because the oppressive dynamic had lifted. With George gone, there was less conflict. There was less tension. There was also less extraordinary music, but that was a different problem. When George finally returned, it was under duress. The other band members convinced him that the Beatles needed him for Abbey Road. George agreed to return, but something permanent had shifted. The mentorship dynamic between Paul and George was dead. The admiration George once felt had curdled into resentment. And most importantly, George had proven something to himself. He could survive without the Beatles. He had talent. He had ideas. He did not need Paul to validate his artistry. Abbey Road became the album where George finally got his due. Two of his songs, Something and Here Comes the Sun, became some of the most celebrated compositions in the Beatles' entire catalog. Paul himself later called Something one of the best songs George ever wrote. But the timing was significant. George had to walk out. George had to force a crisis. George had to prove his worth through absence before he was finally given space to be heard. The Beatles broke up in April 1970. Officially, the reasons were complex. Creative differences, business disagreements, and the loss of their manager Brian Epstein, who had died in 1967. But those who were close to the band understood a deeper truth. The brotherhood had fractured. The four men who had conquered the world together could no longer occupy the same room without tension. For George, the breakup felt like liberation. He released his solo album All Things Must Pass in 1970, and it was extraordinary. Critics called it a masterpiece. It proved what George had known for years. He was a complete artist in his own right. He did not need the Beatles. He did not need Paul's validation. He had his own voice, his own vision, his own genius. But the cost of that liberation was the loss of his brother. For the next 2 decades, George and Paul barely spoke. They did not collaborate. They did not support each other's projects. They did not even attend each other's concerts. The mentorship had become a cold distance. The admiration had become indifference. And beneath it all, the love that once bound them lay wounded and unacknowledged. But the most painful part of this story, the part that reveals everything about why they were really fighting, is still ahead. and it changes everything we thought we knew about their feud. To understand why Paul and George's relationship broke down so completely, we need to understand the architecture of fame itself. The Beatles did not fail because they ran out of ideas. They failed because the structure that had made them successful became toxic. From the very beginning, John and Paul were positioned as the creative leaders. The entire recording industry, the management, the fans, everyone reinforced this hierarchy. George was not equal. This was not stated explicitly, but it was communicated every single day through action, through studio priority, through songwriting credit. When you spend 8 years in a hierarchy that tells you you're less than, it does not matter how much you accomplish. The hierarchy becomes your identity. Beatles never developed a true collaborative system where all 4 voices had equal weight. Instead, they had a benevolent dictatorship by Paul and John. This works when everyone is grateful to be there. It becomes suffocating when people develop their own artistry and their own vision. George tried to renegotiate his position many times. He made requests in interviews. He made requests in recording sessions. He tried to assert his songwriting, but the system was too entrenched. Paul did not intend to be oppressive, but intention does not matter when the result is oppression. Paul never had to face the consequences of his choices until George walked out. No one confronted Paul about his dominating behavior. No one said, "You are losing your brother." And without that confrontation, Paul could not change. What emerges from this analysis is not a story about Paul being a villain or George being too sensitive. It is a story about how success can corrupt relationships, how power, even when well-intentioned, can fracture bonds, how 2 talented men can love music so much that they forget to love each other. The pattern that George was experiencing was not unique to the Beatles. It is the pattern that appears whenever there is unequal power in equal partnerships. For 24 years, Paul and George existed in a state of cordial distance. They made appearances at Beatles events. They were photographed together occasionally. But the warmth was gone. The brotherhood was gone. They had become men who once shared everything and now shared almost nothing. And then in 1994, something shifted. Apple Records was preparing to release previously unreleased recordings of John Lennon, demos that John had made in the 1970s and 80s. These were raw, vulnerable recordings where John was experimenting with new technology and new sounds. The project required Paul and George to work together, to listen together, to make creative decisions together. For the first time in decades, they were in the same room with a shared purpose. And something unexpected happened. The music brought them back. Not completely. The old tensions were still there, lurking beneath the surface. But the music created a bridge. As they listened to John's voice, as they made decisions about what John would have wanted, they began to remember why they had chosen this life in the first place. They had chosen it for the music, for each other. But here is where the story becomes most devastating. Even as they were finding their way back to each other, George was getting sick. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer. He underwent treatment, recovered, and everyone believed he would be fine. And then in 1998, the cancer returned, this time as brain cancer. George's health was deteriorating rapidly. Time, which had seemed infinite when they were young, suddenly had a deadline. Paul did not wait anymore. He visited George repeatedly during his illness. He sat with his younger brother, the boy he had mentored on Liverpool buses, the artist he had once overshadowed, and they talked. Not about music, not about the Beatles, just as brothers. About memory, about regret, about love. On November 29th, 2001, George Harrison died. He was 58 years old. When Paul received the news, something inside him broke open. He had spent 24 years at a distance from his brother. He had spent nearly 30 years fighting with him. And in the end, they had only had a few years of peace before George was taken away. In interviews following George's death, Paul spoke about what he felt. He described George as my little baby brother. He described the joy of reconnecting. He described the pain of losing him just when they had found each other again. But most significantly, he spoke about something that had been obscured by the conflict all those years. He had always loved George. Paul said, "George and I had our differences, but underneath it all was always a bond that nothing could break. We were brothers first. The Beatles was something we did together, but being brothers was who we were. I realized that only after he was gone. This revelation, that love had persisted beneath the resentment, that brotherhood had outlasted the conflict, is the most important part of the story, because it means the feud was never about hate. It was about two talented men trying to navigate an impossible situation. It was about power and control and creativity being forced into a single container. It was about love being expressed through dominance on one side and rebellion on the other. And underneath it all, it was just brothers who needed each other. George Harrison's death left Paul with something he would spend the rest of his life processing: the knowledge that he had almost lost his brother without ever truly reconciling the pain between them. In the years following George's death, Paul has spoken more openly about their relationship than ever before. He has described moments of profound regret about the years they lost to conflict. He has also, however, spoken about his pride in George's eventual triumph as a solo artist. George had to leave the Beatles to become George Harrison, Paul said in an interview, and I had to let him go. That was the hardest thing I ever did. Today, George's death has become a lens through which Paul understands everything that came before it. The Beatles were not a failure. The breakup was not a tragedy. It was the only way that four young men could become four complete artists. George's rebellion was not betrayal. It was survival. There is a tree in Paul's garden. He planted it in memory of George. He has described it as a living reminder of his brother, growing, changing, becoming more beautiful with time. The tree does not fix the past. It does not erase the conflict or the resentment or the wasted years. But it acknowledges that something precious existed and something precious was lost and something precious remains. Paul has also noted that George's children and his own children are close. They are friends. They support each other's work. The rivalry that once defined Paul and George has not been passed down. Instead, what has been passed down is the memory of two brothers who loved music and each other, even when they could not quite figure out how to do both at the same time. So here is what remains after we examine Paul and George's 30-year journey. A story about ambition, about power, about control, but most importantly, a story about love. About how love can be expressed through conflict. About how brotherhood can survive estrangement. About how talent can divide us even as connection binds us together. But I want to hear directly from you on this. Do you think Paul McCartney was wrong to be so controlling in the Beatles? Or was he simply a visionary artist doing what was necessary to create masterpieces? And more importantly, do you believe that what Paul and George shared at the end, those final years of reconciliation, was enough to heal what had been broken? This is not a simple question with a simple answer, but it is a question that matters, because Paul's relationship with George reveals something fundamental about human nature, that we are capable of sustaining conflicts across decades, and also capable of transcending them before it is too late. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation truly belongs to all of us. What do you think Paul should have done differently? And if this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own pride, your own need to control the people you love, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind the icons we thought we knew.